careful with that. It contains valuable equipment. Let me give you a hand.
Thank you, sir.
Come on, keep it steady. Right. Careful. It's got my best microscope in there. Laboratory. No, never mind. That goes in the main bedroom.
Professor Hardy?
Yes?
Susan Bartlett. We spoke on the phone.
Oh, yes. And look, on second thoughts, put that in the guest bedroom, would you? I'm sorry. Let's go indoors. It's the last door on the right. I quite forgot what a painful process it is, moving house.
I could come back at some other time.
No, of course not. I wouldn't dream of it. Please, come. Everything should have been clear by now. That removal van was late, and well, do sit down. I'll get a chair.
No, it's quite all right, really.
Well, at least we can be warm. Now, I understand that you have some experience of medical research.
Yes, though not really in your kind of work, Professor.
Well, I assume since you answered my advertisement.
I was a medical secretary at one time. More recently, I worked for an agency which provides technical secretarial help.
Well, I'm afraid the task I had in mind does require some specialized knowledge. You see, I haven't got the time to do it myself.
Well, I've been involved in several medical and scientific research projects.
Such as?
Well, just taking the notes, typing them up and keeping the files.
I'm afraid the job really is only for a limited period. It wouldn't be a permanent one.
No, I appreciate that. Would you give me a trial? I would like the chance to try. I'm sure I could do it.
Are you?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I've always enjoyed the
Professor!
research projects.
Yes, what is it?
Professor!
Excuse me.
Oh, there you are, sir. Anywhere special for this?
Yes, in there, if you please. The lady would appreciate it. Ask her to sit down.
Very good, sir. Oh, excuse me, miss. The professor said this is for you. All right there?
Thank you.
Let's hope there's no damage done.
Well, no, that one I've got it open.
Well, will you kindly check through everything very carefully before they leave, in case we have to make a claim?
All right. Wouldn't mind knocking this over by accident. It's time you had a new one.
There are times, Price, when I find your sense of humour most trying.
Wasn't being funny. You get another one on the insurance. Why not?
Because it's my property and not yours. And I say not.
Fair enough. Stupid old...
I'm sorry. Oh, where were we?
Oh, I've read your book, Professor. The Mythology of Murder.
Really? Well, what did you think of it?
Rather gruesome.
Well, murder usually is. However, your interest may benefit my next royalty statement.
I borrowed it when I knew I was coming to meet you.
And I suppose that demonstrates a certain determination. Look, supposing we were to try this task I had in mind, it should be simple to a trained specialist, and we could see from there.
Fine.
The subject matter is, refers to the dating of skeletal remains. Does that mean anything to you?
In vague terms, I'm
Well,
afraid.
yes?
Well, I know that old bones are always being uncovered, excavations for buildings, that sort of thing, and that dating them is naturally considered important.
Vague enough, but good enough. It would involve you reading all relevant literature. You would have to consult chemical abstracts and the Index Medicus.
Yes, I think I know what that is. A sort of cumulative index which lists all articles published in medical journals all over the world.
And where would you go to find one?
Oxford, the Radcliffe Scientific Library.
Excellent. Then you may consult it and the chemical abstracts for me. And I want you to look up anything relevant to the amino acid contents of bones, over the last 10 years. Right? I'd like you to meet my assistant, Price. He's an up-and-coming young chemist, but don't tell him I said so. This is, or rather will be, my laboratory. And this is Mr. Price, Miss Susan Bartlett, who is also assisting me.
Right.
Thank you.
Isn't that thing connected up yet?
No.
Excuse me.
He's taken you on, then?
Yes. At least he's giving me a trial.
I'm not surprised.
Howdy. Worsley. Oh, Colin, my dear fellow, how are you? Oh, yes. I've sold my place in Warwickshire. Well, I'm moving in just at this moment, as a matter of fact. What's that? Oh, the Durban case. Yes, it was offered to me. Yes, I've taken it on.
Mrs. Bartlett, is it?
Miss...
You wore rings at one time, though.
Yes.
Divorced? Widowed?
Divorced.
Long?
Why?
You don't like talking about it?
At the moment, no. If you don't mind.
I don't mind. Got to work together, that's all.
Of course, Colin, I'd be delighted to see you. No, that goes in the dining room.
Very good, sir.
I'm very sorry. But the day after tomorrow? Yeah, well, in that case, I'll have to give you directions. Oh, you're coming by train. Well, I'll meet you then. Goodbye.
Colin, hello. Good to see you, John.
Pleasure to see you.
How are you?
Fine, you know, fine.
Very kind of you to meet me like this.
Nonsense, no trouble.
I don't drive anymore.
Really?
I had a serious accident.
Oh, I didn't know.
Thank you. The other man was entirely to blame, but somehow I couldn't face driving again after that.
Yes. Well, it can have that effect.
A charming house. Delightful.
Well, things will look better when everything's cleared up. Sit down.
Thank you.
Drink. I made sure that necessary objects were unpacked.
Please, whiskey.
Good. I'll join you.
What are you doing with yourself, John?
Well, I needed a complete change. And so I've arranged my commitments to give myself elbow room. Water or soda.
Water, please.
And have freedom to pursue work in which I'm really interested.
Thank you. The very best.
Good luck.
Nice to be able to pick and choose.
Oh, well, I still have to earn my living, you know. Now, I've accepted an appointment as consultant pathologist to the Inner London coroner.
That should keep you busy.
2 or 3 days a week, perhaps.
And now you're a professor of forensic medicine.
Yes, the drive into Oxford isn't far from here.
Mm-hmm.
And you still happy in your work?
Oh, just a humble hospital pathologist, John. That's my limit.
Oh, well. You're working in the county you love, part of the community, and you've your home and your family.
Yes, my children are all grown up now, but they come and stay whenever they can. I hope you won't mind my saying how sorry I was to hear about your wife.
Yes, I appreciated your letter. It was very kind.
Well, I expect you've guessed why I wanted to talk to you, apart from the pleasure of seeing you again.
Yes, tell me, how did you come to be involved in a murder case?
Well,
My assistant will answer that.
Who? Oh, wait a minute, I'll ask him.
Who is it?
Dr. Varney?
Yes, I know about that. Dr. Varney?
you know the facts of the case, of course.
I'd like to hear your own account. Now, the cottage was on fire, and the only person in the house was a Mrs. Durban.
Yes. A passerby called the fire brigade. They found Mrs. Durban in the bedroom. She was dead. They thought the fire had originated in the bedroom. Well, the body was brought into the hospital, and I carried out a post-mortem the next day. I thought it would be just routine, but of course...
It wasn't.
No. Mrs. Durban was dead before the fire started. She was strangled, although there were no external signs of this due to severe burns.
Yes. Yes. Right, I'll tell him. Goodbye, Dr. Varney. Who's in with him?
Our medical friend from his student days.
Well, I won't disturb him now.
What have you got?
Photocopies of 10 articles on the amino acid content of bones.
Let's have a look.
Well, shouldn't Professor Hardy see them first?
I might advise you not to show him. Depends what you brought.
By the way, that photo in the sitting room, is that Mrs. Hardy?
Was. She was killed in some sort of shotgun accident.
Oh, how awful.
It was before my time. Apparently they thought she'd pull through, but she just collapsed and died. He's an obstinate old devil, the prof. Should have moved years before now, but no. He was going to stick it out.
Well, it takes time to get over something like that.
She's dead, end of story, forget it. Okay, you can show him.
Thank you.
You'll get your brownie badge for that. 10 out of 10.
Durbin was convicted of murder. The evidence purely circumstantial.
Yes, as you can see from the transcript of the trial, Durbin gave himself an alibi that couldn't be substantiated. He was on bad terms with his wife. There was another woman. There is no doubt in my mind that Durbin strangled his wife, then set fire to the bedroom, thinking that the body would be destroyed, then went off to try to establish an alibi. My findings, of course, were crucial to the case. But I can't help wondering why there was no defense post-mortem.
Grave omission, in my opinion. Then, Sir Roger Barnaby was leading counsel for defence, and Roger rather fancies himself as a great advocate. He considers himself above, well, technical evidence from the likes of you and me.
Ah, I see. Has he changed his views since the trial?
I very much doubt it. And as you know, he conducted the first appeal, grounds of misdirection of the jury, and that was dismissed. But I understand since then he has been offered a very lengthy and lucrative fraud case. So he's handed over the Durbin brief to a more up-to-date colleague who thinks that there should be an exhumation and a second post-mortem before the second appeal.
Which you're going to perform?
Yes.
The appeal's on the grounds of new evidence?
Yes.
Some friend of Durbin's has come forward to substantiate his alibi?
That is so. Another drink.
Thank you. I find it very odd that a new witness should come forward after all this time.
There is a Dr. Varney, a psychiatrist practicing in Bristol, and he will say that Mrs. Durbin consulted him, and he thinks that she had suicidal tendencies. Then there's a neighbour who swears that she threatened to commit suicide. Well, I'll be interviewing them both, of course, in due course.
Suicide seems a remarkably unlikely possibility to me in the light of my post-mortem. Mrs. Durbin was strangled, John. There's no way round that.
Well, what counsel chooses to make of the evidence is their business. My job is simply to attend the exhumation and conduct the PM.
It's such a straightforward case, I'm surprised you took it on at all.
Well, it's not really. Not the sort of thing I do by preference, but about the time the offer was made, I had just learnt what the cost of new carpets and new curtains was going to be, so...
So, we shall appear in court on opposing sides.
Just two old friends giving our respective opinions.
Yes, well, please remember that forensic work is not my field. I only became involved by accident, so don't try to tear me to shreds, will you?
I shall simply study the evidence and draw my own conclusions.
Oh, I'm right, John. There's no possible shadow of doubt about that. But I'm a hospital pathologist, not a forensic pathologist. I have no standing compared with a man like you. I don't mind admitting I was a bit shaken when I heard that the defense had approached you. I found giving evidence at the trial a great ordeal. But at least nobody there was trying to prove me wrong.
I shan't be setting out to prove anything, least of all that you're wrong. I shall simply be conducting a post-mortem, as you did, and assessing the facts, as you did. There's really no contest, you know.
It's good to hear you say that, but I knew you would. I don't know whether you'd be interested in studying my findings.
Indeed, I would.
Yes, I must go. I have to get to London to see the DPP solicitor, Mr. Farnham.
Oh, I know, Farnham. I'll run you to the station.
Oh, thank you. Well, we could go over my report just before you do your post-mortem, if you like.
Well, if you'd spare the time, that'd be most helpful.
Professor, Dr. Varney rang. I said I'd ring him straight back. He can't see you in Bristol tomorrow. He's got to be in London. As he's passing here, would it be all right if he called in to see you?
Oh, it's very kind of him. That'd be excellent. Do thank him for me. I was going to take Dr. Worsley to the station.
Right.
Nothing to worry about that I can see, Doctor. You did a perfectly straightforward post-mortem.
Well, I must say I've just left Professor Hardy, and he rather implied that he didn't expect to differ from me.
Well, there you are.
But Hardy's a skillful witness, and defense counsel's bound to lead him and try to cast doubts on my findings.
You can't make bricks without straw. Anyway, to be honest with you, we're not much concerned with the medical evidence this time round.
Yes, I hear there's a new witness come forward.
Yes, they've dug up this weird character to try and confirm Durbin's alibi. And at the same time, they're trying to confuse the issue with talk of suicidal intentions from this psychiatrist, Dr. Varney, and the neighbour, what's her name, Mrs. Lawson.
I can't see what they hope to gain from that. Mrs. Durbin was strangled beyond any shadow of doubt.
This new evidence, I'm surprised they're getting into court with it at all. Still, ours not to reason why. We're not too concerned, and you shouldn't be either.
I don't quite understand why you were not available to give evidence at the trial, Dr. Varney.
I went to America 2 weeks before she died. I was there for over a year taking part in a research project. I didn't even know she was dead until I got back.
Would I be right in assuming that she was not referred to under the National Health Machinery? Otherwise, surely there would have been some report of the visits, and the defence could have brought up her state of mind before.
Mrs. Durbin consulted me privately. She had money of her own, as you may know.
Oh, an inheritance, I remember.
£20,000 from an uncle 2 years before she died.
Yes, the prosecution made a good point of that.
Well, poor Mrs. Durbin certainly thought her husband was after it.
You have reservations about that?
Durbin was having business difficulties.
Small grocer in the next village, I think. Yeah.
And like so many other small shopkeepers these days, not doing very well. However, Mrs. Durbin put his problems down to his spending habits. He bought popularity, she said.
At the pubs, I suppose.
This is her version, not mine.
Oh, naturally.
Miss Durbin wanted to use her money to buy a new house. She refused. He wants it for his fancy woman, not me, she said. She knew about Durbin's lady friend, who was a younger person.
Yes, quite.
Oh, that was her fear, Professor. The end of her marriage. Here. He doesn't love me anymore. He doesn't want me. He's never home. But there's no indication that she was ever afraid of him in the physical sense.
I see.
She had many grievances against her husband, but she makes no reference whatever to any violence, actual or threatened.
And were those grievances justified, do you think?
My concern is for the patient, Professor, not with making judgments.
But now that she's dead, looking back, an opinion.
She was an unhappy woman in a wretched situation. I expect she exaggerated quite a bit. She was wholly wrapped up in herself. She was menopausal.
And you thought she had suicidal tendencies?
She was a neurotic woman in a somewhat disturbed state. I thought she needed help.
Which you were giving.
As best I could, aye.
Yes, but if you were in fear for her life...
I wouldn't go that far. Fear, no. Fear's too strong a word. There was a question mark in my mind, perhaps.
See, if there is a diagnosis of suicidal tendencies...
Oh, that's a very serious matter, of course. And on the last occasion that Mrs. Durbin came to visit me, I advised her to go for treatment as an inpatient, either within the National Health Service or privately. She agreed to be treated privately. I made arrangements for her to enter a nursing home, and then I left for America. As far as I knew, she was being well cared for.
But she never turned up at that nursing home.
As I later found out, no.
Doesn't that surprise you?
One's grip on some patients is tenuous. There are those, and I think Mrs. Durbin was one of them, who regard a few visits to the psychiatrist as the equivalent of the laying on of hands. A few magic phrases will produce the miracle. Well, I don't have any magic phrases, and in my mind there are no miracles. Well, I really must be going. I've got a long drive ahead of me.
Well, thank you very much. Most helpful.
Pleasure.
Tell me, when you were treating her, did you prescribe any drugs?
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Bye. Is he gone?
Yes.
Just been talking to a friend of mine who works in the psychiatric department of the infirmary. Reckons Varney knows his stuff.
Is there any city in Great Britain where you have not got some friend holding an influential position?
Not a lot, no. Some on the continent, too.
Well, on this occasion, I think I agree with your friend. Though I'm a little worried how he may stand up in cross-examination, but Varney is a very able man, and I have a respect for his opinion.
Surely no one commits suicide by strangling themselves.
As a matter of fact, the method has been tried. It is not unknown. I think I'll go and see Mrs. Lawson in the morning. You can drive me.
Well, this looks like it.
Wait here for me, will you? Mrs. Lawson,
Yes?
my name is Hardy. Professor Hardy.
Oh, yes. I heard it from her own lips, that's how.
But you didn't come forward at the trial.
No one asked me. Besides, they said he'd killed her.
Mr. Durbin.
He'd made her suffer enough. Why shouldn't he have a taste? Oh, he was well liked by some people, by his friends at the local pub, maybe, when he was buying drinks all round. But they didn't think about his wife, did they? Staying home alone night after night. I wouldn't have said a word now, except that this lawyer who's defending him came down here and asked me straight out. Though what good it will do him, I can't see. I mean, she was murdered, wasn't she?
That was the verdict of the trial.
I can't deny what she'd said. But besides, it appears they can make me speak, whether I want to or not.
By way of subpoena, yes. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Do you recall Mrs. Durbin's exact words to you?
Oh, yes. She said, Mary, I've had enough. I'm going to put an end to it. And I said, oh, no. Come, love, no. Don't be silly. And she said, no, I mean it. I can't go on living like this. I'd rather be dead.
Do you know if she was in the habit of taking sleeping pills?
No. Don't know anything about that at all.
Thank you, Mrs. Lawson. Much obliged to you.
But she didn't kill herself, did she? Someone strangled her. And if it wasn't him, then who was it?
The skin was badly burnt in the fire, so there was, of course, no possibility of checking for lacerations or bruises on the throat.
No, of course not.
Then I found that the hyoid bone had been fractured.
So I see. Yes.
From which I concluded that she'd been murdered. Substantiated by a hemorrhage at the back of the throat, and the fact that she was dead before the fire started, since there was no carbon monoxide in the blood.
Well?
Hmm?
Is that everything?
I think so, yes.
Ah. Right, well, thank you, Colin. Normally I would, of course, ask you to stay and observe, but I know you have an appointment at the hospital.
Well, I've been thinking I could always telephone and say I'm a little late.
No, you mustn't miss your appointment.
Well, perhaps we could meet for a chat before the hearing.
Yes, of course.
Until then.
Goodbye. Hyoid bone fractured at junction of left greater cornea with the body. No visible hemorrhage at site of fracture. Well, we'll take a blood sample and another section of lung tissue. There. Have a look. On your own beautiful, glorious new machine. Well?
Something there. What is it?
Smoke particles. Five milligrams, 100 milliliters of blood. We'll set up a chromatogram tomorrow, find out what type it is.
Why didn't Wesley check all this?
Well, I imagine he thought it wasn't necessary. There were all the signs of strangulation.
Did your friend make a proper botch up of this?
It's going to take some time to sort all these files out, I'm afraid.
If you achieve it at all, it'll be a miracle. May I congratulate you, Miss Bartlett, on your work so far?
Well, thank you.
Just wondering if you might find time for another task.
Now?
Well, I just wanted to dictate a post-mortem report.
Yes, of course.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, I'll have this on my own letter heading, 4 copies, if you please, and to these people, the solicitors. Right? Now, 9 a.m. on Tuesday, that's today's date, I was present at St. Luke's Churchyard, Little Wold, W-O-L-D, when a coffin was exhumed from a grave identified by the sexton, Mr. John Cole, C-O-L-E, as being that of Mrs. Eleanor Durbin, buried on, well, the date is in the letter. Also present were Mr. Samuel Grange, G-R-A-N-G-E, undertaker, who identified the coffin and the plate as being of Mrs. Eleanor Durbin. Chief Inspector Hillary and Dr. Colin Worsley were also present. Now, the coffin was in good condition and was fairly dry. I'm afraid it is going to run to a few thousand words.
It's quite all right, Professor. You can stay as long as you like.
Oh, that is splendid. Right. Well, I took soil from above, below, and the sides of the coffin, which was then transported to the mortuary.
What on earth are you doing?
I thought it was a good idea. Wasn't.
I've finished the report.
All right, I'll come in and check it now.
Fine.
I'll see who it is.
You know what I think?
About what?
Durbin's alibi's phony. When he left that pub, he went home. He saw the cottage was on fire. He knew his wife was in it. So he took himself off for a couple of hours to make sure she was well and truly dead.
Your guess, whether intelligent or not, has no relevance.
Suppose I'm right for a minute.
Well?
Well, that's murder in my book. Just as much as if she'd been strangled twice over.
It's Dr. Worsley, Professor. He'd like to see you, if possible.
Oh, dear. All right, well, look, get the 2 top copies off straight away, registered.
Right.
Colin.
Sorry to intrude like this.
No, it's just I wasn't expecting visitors, as you can see.
I had a conference at Guy's, and my son-in-law very kindly drove me down. He's an airline pilot, you know. He's on leave at the moment.
Well, don't leave him sitting outside. Do ask him in.
No. I can only stay a moment. I only decided to call on impulse, just to say hello.
Will you have a drink, now that you're here?
A quick one, thank you. How did your post-mortem go?
Oh, like any other post-mortem.
Nothing out of the way?
Nothing I haven't come across before in the course of my career.
Can I take it then we shan't be in conflict?
I concurred with the observations you made. Your health.
Then, presumably, you agreed with my conclusions.
Colin, I can't give my findings to anyone, not even to you. You must know that.
I think if you agreed with me, there would be no harm in saying so.
My report is confidential to the defense representatives.
At least you could give me some indication. We've known each other all our lives. After all, to me, it's a matter of some personal concern.
As it is to Durbin. He's still in prison.
She was dead. Strangled. Before the fire started. How? Are you implying you found something I missed?
I'm sorry, Colin.
Of course. I shouldn't have asked you. I apologize. I must go. Thank you for the drink.
Look, let me see you out.
Please don't trouble. We shall meet in court.
Colin, may I make a suggestion?
Please do.
Go over your report very carefully. Read all the relevant literature, in particular Brown-John's Physics of Combustion.
I see. Thank you.
Oh. Goodbye, Dr. Worsley.
Miss Bartlett.
Can I help?
Look, that Mexican article I gave you.
Who is there?
Well, I told you that I only read Spanish with difficulty. Do you read Spanish?
No.
Well, then you'll have to get it translated properly, won't you?
I told you, Professor. It's reprinted in Munich.
Oh, did you?
There we are.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Really? Is it like an ordinary court hearing? A second appeal?
What? Oh, that, no. Well, no, it's not the real appeal. It's a judge sitting rather like a magistrate. He just has to decide whether there's a prima facie case for a new appeal.
Well, I'm very interested. Could I be there? At least when you're giving your evidence.
I don't see why not. Been using a very interesting technique for the dating of bones in Mexico. It relates the ratio of the free amino acids to those obtained from acid hydrolysis, the codagenous stroma. You speak German?
No. Wasn't it written in Spanish?
Yes, it was. I'll have to translate it myself.
Is Worsley cottoned on yet?
No.
Would you like to ease him off the hook?
Unfortunately, I can't.
Oh, I know a chap called Arthur. I'd give him a ring and drop him a hint about what was in your report.
Arthur? What are you talking about? Arthur? Who?
Just Arthur. So happens he's a clerk with the DPP solicitor.
Will you kindly keep such unethical suggestions to yourself?
I can't help being worried. I don't know what we can do exactly.
Dr. Worsley, he'd need to blow your post-mortem to pieces, and you assure me he can't do that.
I'm sure he can't.
Now look at what the defence have got. 2 witnesses about suicidal intentions. Counsel will deal with them, I assure you.
But there's this alibi, this man who claims he saw Durbin in Barnstaple at the time.
Mr. Jack Reed, who runs a small travelling fair, yes. We have a sworn statement from a police constable who was on duty at the fairground that night, knows Reed well by sight. The constable is positive that Reed did not leave the fair until gone midnight. Reed's lying, Doctor, and we shall prove it.
Mr. Farnham, I am in a very vulnerable position.
But you found she'd been strangled.
Because of my findings, a man has been convicted of murder. Suppose I am to be challenged by Professor Hardy, a criminal pathologist with an international reputation.
He can only niggle at details, surely, try and raise doubts.
Yes, but he's an expert. He's a criminal pathologist. I'm only a hospital pathologist. I don't have his skill in the witness box. Mr. Farnham, suppose my professional ability is to be questioned. I do enjoy a certain reputation.
Dr. Worsley, in my considerable experience, innocent men with nothing to fear do not rely on weak alibis supported by a witness willing to perjure himself.
So you admit, Dr. Varney, that you did not take the dead woman's so-called suicidal tendencies very seriously?
She was the sort of woman who
could have committed suicide, yes, you said that, Doctor, but I'm trying to establish the depth of your concern, bearing in mind the fact that you did not think it urgent to inquire after her welfare.
I was in America.
There are postal and telephone services.
I thought she'd been admitted to a nursing home.
But you weren't sufficiently worried about her to make certain.
I had no reason to.
Doctor, you are a successful psychiatrist, working both in private practice and in the National Health Service.
Yes.
Now, in the past 3 years, how many patients have you treated who had suicidal tendencies, in your opinion?
Oh.
Approximately.
About 50 or 60, I suppose.
And how many of those patients with suicidal tendencies have actually killed themselves in that time?
Well, none, but...
None? Not 1 out of 50 or 60?
Aye, but that doesn't mean that
Thank you, Dr. Varney, that is all.
I think this may be a convenient moment to adjourn for lunch.
Judge is fed up. I don't blame him. The alibi's killed, stone dead. And this talk of suicide leaves him cold after your evidence. Pathetic. Still, the defence asked for it.
Oh, well, Dr. Worsley.
Yes.
Professor Hardy will be called after lunch. Now, I'd like you to sit just behind me so you can give me your comments as he goes through his report.
I swear that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Your full name is John Hardy.
It is.
You are a registered medical practitioner?
I am.
And consultant forensic pathologist?
I am.
Would you tell his lordship and the court what qualifications and appointments you hold?
I'm a doctor of medicine, a bachelor of science, a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, a doctor of philosophy. I hold diplomas in medical jurisprudence and in clinical pathology.
And your appointments?
I'm professor of forensic medicine at Oxford, and I'm consultant pathologist to the Inner London coroner.
Now then, Professor Hardy, were you present at the exhumation of Mrs. Eleanor Durbin on the 14th of this month, and did you subsequently perform a second post-mortem on the remains?
I did.
I couldn't find a place to park the car. Am I too late?
No, it's bags of time. Just getting through his report now. You know what's in there. Just sit down. Take a good hour.
Well, what then?
Then he'll be cross-examined. That'll be the interesting bit.
So in conclusion, and bearing in mind all the foregoing findings of my examination, I am unable to agree with the interpretations of Dr. Colin Worsley at his first post-mortem examination.
Thank you, Professor Hardy.
Professor Hardy.
One moment, please, Mr. Lama.
My lad.
Professor Hardy, I wish to be clear in my mind. You accept Dr. Worsley's observations, but you draw different conclusions. Is that so?
Yes, my lad.
In addition, you emphasize important findings which Dr. Worsley failed to make?
That is so.
Ah, thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Lana.
Thank you, my lad. Professor Hardy, when you examined the remains of Mrs. Durbin, you found that the hyoid bone was fractured.
Yes.
The hyoid bone?
The hyoid bone, my lad, is a small U-shaped bone, somewhat fragile. It is placed here, and it serves as a movable base for the tongue. If you would care to look at this diagram, it will explain the thing quite clearly.
But you do not regard the fracture of that in itself as proof of murder?
Not necessarily, no.
But is it not the classical sign of strangulation?
No, I would expect to see antemortem bleeding at the site of fracture before laying any significance upon a broken hyoid. I could find no traces of such bleeding.
Well, both you and Dr. Worsley found a hemorrhage at the back of the throat. Now, does that not show that Mrs. Durbin was strangled, the hyoid bone fractured, as a result of which internal bleeding occurred?
No. The occurrence to which you refer is a common post-mortem artifact.
It may be common to you, Professor Hardy, but we are laymen in these matters.
I'm sorry, my lord. When a body is laid in a horizontal position for any period of time, blood accumulates at the back of the throat due to the force of gravity and because the blood is no longer circulating.
I see.
This was demonstrated some years ago by South African pathologists.
Thank you.
And if you would be so good as to glance at the diagram again, you will see that post-mortem accumulation of blood cannot be confused with ante-mortem bleeding at the point of fracture.
Professor Hardy, for all your endeavours to cast doubts on Dr. Worsley's findings, we cannot get away from the fact that the hyoid bone was fractured, can we?
Oh, certainly not.
Now, you say that Mrs. Durbin was not strangled.
I say there is insufficient evidence to draw that conclusion.
In which event we must account for the hyoid bone being broken, mustn't we? Now, when my learned friend asked in what way you could explain this, you seemed remarkably reluctant to answer, if I may say so.
I am never anxious to hazard guesses in answer to questions.
Now, when pressed by my learned friend, you said it was possible for a pathologist himself to fracture the bone in the course of his work. You now describe that reply as a mere guess.
Yes.
But a guess founded on previous experience, Professor. Have you come across similar circumstances before?
I have, my lord.
So it is your opinion that it could be that Dr. Worsley accidentally, without realizing it, broke the hyoid bone himself during the first post-mortem?
It is conceivable, my lord, but no one can know for certain.
Ah.
And so, Professor Hardy, either Mrs. Durbin was strangled, or an experienced and able pathologist like Dr. Worsley made a gross error. And you prefer the latter explanation?
In my opinion, Mrs. Durbin was not strangled. As for the post-mortem, I can give no opinion, since I was not present.
Now, in your evidence, you lay great emphasis on the particles of smoke which you found.
Yes, they were taken from a deep section of the lung, and they prove that life was not extinct when the fire was burning.
And yet, like Dr. Worsley, you found no carbon monoxide in the blood. But surely anyone still breathing during a fire would inhale carbon monoxide, would they not?
A fire can take many forms. It can produce smoke before producing carbon monoxide. Mrs. Durbin inhaled smoke and evidently died before there was an appreciable amount of carbon monoxide in the air. I have come across this on many occasions before.
Yes, well, I take your word for it. So she was unconscious, left for dead by her attacker, and lived just long enough to breathe in some smoke.
There is no evidence of there being an attacker. But when I tested Mrs. Durbin's blood for the presence of drugs, I found that she had ingested a lethal dose of barbiturates in the form of sodium amytal, 5 milligrams per 100 millilitres of blood, far in excess of the therapeutic dose which had been prescribed by her doctor and for which her chemist was giving her regularly capsules.
Yes, the presence of drugs was not brought out before. I suppose you were entitled to make such play with your discovery.
Well, it does suggest a possible explanation for Mrs. Durbin's death. That did not come forward in evidence at the trial.
Indeed, an alternative explanation, which it is no doubt the duty of the defence to find if they can. But I put it to you, Professor, that nothing you say necessarily invalidates the original post-mortem findings of Dr. Worsley. He believed that Mrs. Durbin was strangled. You doubt that?
I doubt it, because there is insufficient evidence to justify such a belief.
According to you, Professor, not according to Dr. Worsley. Experts rarely agree, as I'm sure you know, my lad. Now, despite the additional factors which were brought to our attention and the reservations which we've expressed, Mrs. Durbin could have been strangled. Would you admit that?
She could, but I see no reason to assume that she was.
Because of the presence of a fatal dose of barbiturates?
Partly.
But you weren't in that cottage, Professor. You don't know what happened. I mean, Mrs. Durbin could have taken sleeping tablets and then Durbin strangled her. Or he could have given her drugs first in order to make it easier to kill her.
All kinds of things could have happened. It is not my job to fabricate hypotheses.
But such hypotheses would be consistent with your post-mortem findings. That is so, isn't it?
Nothing is impossible.
Thank you, Professor.
But I feel bound
That is all, Professor.
My lad, I had not completed my answer to learned counsel's question.
The court would prefer to hear your full reply, Professor.
But I feel bound to add, my lad, that learned counsel's hypotheses strain credulity to the utmost limit. There is no evidence that Mrs. Durbin suffered violence of any kind, but there is overwhelming evidence that she died from an overdose, self-administered, of drugs.
Professor Hardy, it is true that experts often disagree, each honestly holding his own opinion. However, on this occasion, a man has been tried and sentenced for murder and has already served a period of imprisonment. But you with all the authority of your great experience and reputation, now suggest that no murder took place at all. If this court is to accept your suggestion, the question is bound to arise as to whether or not there was not some degree of incompetence in the way the first post-mortem was carried out.
Lad, I would not wish to imply any criticism of Dr. Worsley whatever, but I would like to say that I think it a very great pity that the defence did not carry out their own post-mortem in the first instance. The findings would then have come forward in evidence at the trial, and all this could have been avoided.
Morning. Got away with it then?
Yes, appeal was allowed. Durbin was released.
Picture in the paper, kissing his girlfriend. They're going to get married and blow the 20,000 quid he got by letting his wife die.
I'm sure it doesn't say that.
No, that's what I say.
You had Durbin stay in prison.
He drove her to suicide and then let her get on with it. And who set fire to the cottage? No one answered that. Your friend was wrong about nearly everything, but he was right about Durbin.
He was not asked to be right about Durbin. He was asked to be right about Mrs. Durbin. There he was wrong. Morning, Susan.
Oh, good morning. Oh, I managed to get Dr. Worsley on the phone. He wasn't at the hospital. I got him at his home.
Why didn't you tell me?
He said he didn't want to speak to you, Professor.
Oh, I see.